A millionaire laughed at a nurse for her modest lifestyle, believing she wasn't important. What he learned about her history turned his world upside down. The Astoria Grand Hotel loomed against the evening skyline like a fortress of wealth. Inside, the grand ballroom was alive with the hum of conversations punctuated by the clink of crystal glasses and the gentle strains of a string quartet. Gilded walls, sparkling chandeliers, and polished floors reflected the opulence of New York's elite gathered for yet another charity gala. To most in the room, this was not about philanthropy. It was a performance, a place to be seen, to measure success not by acts of kindness, but by the weight of donations and the glamour of appearances. Jonathan Steele, a man whose very name evoked power, moved through the crowd like a king surveying his kingdom. His bespoke charcoal suit hugged his athletic frame perfectly, the glint of his gold cufflinks catching the light with every deliberate movement. His expression, a practiced blend of indifference and charm, carried the message he didn't need to say aloud. "I'm better than you." He didn't believe in charity. Not really. To Jonathan, donations were a tax strategy, a way to buy influence, or, in tonight's case, both. This gala's cause was a nursing fund for under-resourced hospitals, a subject that held no personal interest for him. Still, his assistant Lydia had insisted he attend. Jonathan, she had warned earlier that day, her voice clipped as she reviewed his schedule. "Healthcare is a hot topic right now. Showing up for this will look good." "Healthcare is always a hot topic," he'd replied, barely glancing up from his phone. "And it'll still be one when I'm dead." Even now, as Lydia trailed behind him clutching her ever-present tablet, Jonathan leaned into her. "How much are we throwing at this one?" $200,000. "It's generous enough to draw attention, but not so much that it seems performative," Lydia answered without breaking stride. "Good," Jonathan replied, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Let's hope they know how to spend it." The crowd shifted, and Jonathan's sharp eyes scanned the room. Familiar faces floated by, a tech mogul nursing a martini, a senator whispering conspiratorially with a media executive. Predictable players in an endless game of influence. He was about to turn toward the bar when someone caught his attention. Standing near the edge of the room, next to the dessert table, was a woman who didn't belong. Her navy blue dress was simple, modest even, in stark contrast to the sequined gowns and tailored tuxedos around her. Her hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her face was free of the heavy makeup so many of the other women wore like armor. She stood alone, sipping a glass of water, her posture relaxed yet purposeful. "Who's that?" Jonathan asked Lydia, nodding toward the woman. Lydia followed his gaze, tapping quickly on her tablet. "Claire Bennett. She's a nurse. Invited by the hospital board in recognition of her exceptional service." "A nurse?" Jonathan repeated, his tone dripping with incredulity. "And she came dressed like that?" Lydia shot him a warning glance, but didn't respond. She knew Jonathan's tendency to mock those he deemed unremarkable, and she wasn't about to give him ammunition. Jonathan, however, was already intrigued. Nurses didn't usually grace events like this, and certainly not with such indifference to the spectacle. He sipped his whiskey, his mind whirring with the kind of curiosity he often mistook for disdain. Who was this woman, and why didn't she seem to care about the glittering world around her? Unable to resist, he approached. "Claire Bennett, I presume," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone used to commanding attention. Claire turned to him, her brown eyes meeting his with a calm, steady gaze. "And you must be Jonathan Steele." Her handshake was firm, her grip unwavering. Jonathan was struck by how composed she was. There was no awe, no nervous laughter, no attempt to flatter him. It was unnerving. "Enjoying the gala?" he asked, falling back on small talk. "It's interesting," Claire replied, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Interesting?" Jonathan echoed, arching an eyebrow. "That's a diplomatic choice of words." Claire tilted her head slightly. "Well, I've never attended anything like this before. It's a lot to take in." "Let me guess," Jonathan said, his tone tinged with sarcasm. "The grandeur, the opulence. It must be overwhelming." Claire's smile widened, though her eyes remained sharp. "Not really. I just find it fascinating how much money and effort go into these events. All for a good cause, of course." Her words hung in the air, laced with a subtle irony that didn't escape Jonathan. He chuckled softly, though the sound lacked its usual confidence. "Well, someone has to keep the lights on, right? Hospitals don't fund themselves." Claire's expression didn't change, but Jonathan sensed she was seeing through him in a way few people dared. "That's true," she said simply. "But I'd argue that the people who keep hospitals running are just as important." He raised his glass, feigning amusement. "Touché." The conversation might have ended there, but something about Claire's composure irked Jonathan. She wasn't fawning over him, wasn't intimidated by his wealth or status. In fact, she seemed utterly uninterested in him, a rarity in his world. "What made you choose nursing?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. Claire hesitated for a moment, her gaze softening. "It wasn't really a choice. It was something I felt called to do. Helping people, being there in their most vulnerable moments. It's not glamorous, but it's meaningful." Jonathan smirked. "Meaningful doesn't pay the bills." Claire's eyes met his again, and this time, there was a flicker of something stronger. Disapproval, perhaps? "You'd be surprised how fulfilling life can be when money isn't the end goal." The words hit Jonathan harder than he expected. For a moment, he felt a crack in his armor, a sliver of discomfort he couldn't quite place. He quickly masked it with a practiced smile. "Well, I suppose we all find fulfillment in different ways." Claire nodded politely, her expression unreadable. "Indeed. If you'll excuse me, Mr. Steele, I should probably mingle. It was interesting talking to you." With that, she walked away, leaving Jonathan standing alone. He watched her retreating figure, his mind replaying their conversation. He should have been annoyed, even insulted, but instead, he felt unsettled. By the time he left the gala, Claire Bennett's words were still echoing in his head. For the first time in years, Jonathan Steele, master of the universe, felt something he couldn't control: doubt. If you were in Jonathan's shoes, what would you have said to Claire? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button to see how it all unfolds. The morning after the gala, Jonathan Steele sat in his sunlit penthouse office, perched high above the bustling streets of Manhattan. The panoramic view of the city stretched out before him, a visual reminder of his empire. Yet, for once, he wasn't reveling in the grandeur of his success. His thoughts kept circling back to the woman he had met the previous evening, the nurse, Claire Bennett. Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair, his hands clasped behind his head. "A nurse," he muttered to himself, his tone caught between amusement and incredulity. It wasn't her profession that puzzled him. It was her attitude. She had spoken to him like an equal, maybe even as if she had the upper hand. It was rare for Jonathan to feel outmaneuvered in any interaction, and rarer still for it to linger in his thoughts. Lydia entered the room without knocking, balancing a tray with coffee and a croissant. "Good morning, sir. The board meeting is in an hour." Jonathan glanced at her, distracted. "Lydia, find out more about that nurse from last night." "Claire Bennett." Lydia hesitated, unsure if she had heard correctly. "The nurse, sir?" "Yes, the nurse," Jonathan snapped. "She caught my attention. I want to know what makes her tick." Lydia, accustomed to her boss's whims, nodded and left the room. Jonathan returned to his desk, brushing aside thoughts of Claire and focusing on the pile of documents awaiting his signature. Yet, even as he approved contracts and analyzed quarterly reports, her words from the night before echoed in his mind. That afternoon, Jonathan's driver pulled up to a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street, a far cry from the glitzy venues he usually frequented. Lydia had tracked Claire's schedule and found that she often stopped here on her lunch breaks. It was a rare indulgence for her, Lydia had explained. A quiet escape from the chaos of the hospital. Jonathan stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. The cafe was modest, with mismatched chairs and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. He spotted Claire seated at a corner table, a steaming mug in front of her and a notebook open on the table. Her hair was tied back again, and she wore a plain white blouse under her hospital ID badge. "Fancy seeing you here," Jonathan said, sliding into the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. Claire looked up, startled, but quickly composed herself. "Mr. Steele," she said evenly. "This is unexpected." "Call me Jonathan," he replied, flashing his signature grin. "I thought I'd stop by to see how the other half lives." Claire arched an eyebrow, her expression a mix of curiosity and annoyance. "The other half?" "You know," Jonathan said, leaning back in his chair. "The people who actually work for a living." Claire set her pen down, folding her hands on the table. "What do you want, Jonathan?" He smirked at her directness. "Can a man be curious? You left quite an impression on me last night." Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. "Really? Because you didn't strike me as someone who values what I do." Jonathan chuckled, unbothered by her bluntness. "Don't take it personally. I'm not exactly known for my soft side." "I gathered," Claire replied, her tone cool. For a moment, they sat in silence. Jonathan studied her, noting the subtle confidence in her posture and the calm determination in her gaze. She was unlike anyone he'd encountered before. Unimpressed by wealth, unapologetically herself, it intrigued him and irritated him in equal measure. "So, Claire," Jonathan began, his voice adopting the casual tone he used in negotiations. "What keeps you in such a thankless job? Surely you've thought about doing something more lucrative." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line, her patience clearly being tested. "I don't consider my work thankless," she said, "and I've never been motivated by money. Some things matter more." "Like what?" Jonathan asked, genuinely curious despite his usual cynicism. "Like helping people," Claire said simply. "Like knowing that what I do makes a difference." Jonathan shook his head, laughing softly. "You're idealistic, I'll give you that. But don't you ever wonder if it's worth it? Long hours, low pay, dealing with ungrateful patients. Why put yourself through that?" Claire's gaze hardened, her voice steady. "Because it's not about me. It's about the people who need help. The single mother who can't afford proper care, the elderly man who's scared and alone. I'm there for them when no one else is. That's worth more to me than any paycheck." Her words landed like a punch to Jonathan's ego. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. Yet, there was no denying the conviction in her voice. It made him feel small. "Well," he said, masking his discomfort with a wry smile, "you're certainly passionate. I'll give you that." Claire didn't respond immediately. Instead, she picked up her coffee mug, her gaze steady on his. "Why are you really here, Jonathan?" For a moment, he considered lying, brushing off her question with a joke. But something about the way she looked at him made him hesitate. "I suppose I wanted to understand you," he admitted. "You're different." "Different how?" Claire asked, her tone challenging. Jonathan searched for the right words, but came up empty. He wasn't sure how to explain the strange fascination she had sparked in him. Instead, he shrugged, deflecting with humor. "Let's just say you're not what I expected." Claire smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You don't know me, Jonathan. And honestly, I don't think you want to." Before he could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then began gathering her things. "Duty calls," she said, standing. "It was interesting talking to you." Jonathan watched her leave, the faint scent of her coffee lingering in the air. He felt a strange emptiness as she disappeared out the door, as if their conversation had left him with more questions than answers. As he returned to his car, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that Claire Bennett had gotten under his skin. For the first time in years, he found himself intrigued not by power or profit, but by something or someone he couldn't control. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the small staff lounge at St. Mary's Hospital as Claire Bennett poured herself a fresh cup of coffee. It was her third of the day, and the morning shift was only halfway through. The hospital was alive with its usual rhythms. The beep of monitors, the scurry of nurses, the steady stream of patients in need. For Claire, this chaos was routine, demanding but familiar, a stark contrast to the world of glittering galas and hollow smiles she had brushed up against just the night before. She hadn't thought much about Jonathan Steele since their conversation at the cafe. In truth, she hadn't expected to think about him at all. Men like him didn't occupy space in her mind for long. Wealthy, arrogant, dismissive of people like her. Yet, as she stirred sugar into her coffee, Claire found herself replaying their exchange. There had been something about his questions, his probing curiosity, that lingered like an itch she couldn't quite reach. Long night, a voice broke through her thoughts. It was Hannah, a fellow nurse, her blonde hair escaping its bun in wisps that framed her tired face. Claire offered a small smile. The usual. Yeah, well, don't get too comfortable. We've got a fresh batch of admits rolling in, Hannah said, nodding toward the hallway. And Dr. Morales is already looking for you. Claire sighed, setting her mug down and grabbing her clipboard. Never a dull moment. As she moved through the ward, Claire's calm demeanor belied the intensity of her work. She checked charts, adjusted medications, and soothed anxious patients with a few carefully chosen words. It was a rhythm she had perfected over years of practice, but today, her thoughts kept wandering. She remembered Jonathan's question at the cafe. Why put yourself through that? At the time, she had brushed it off, dismissing him as another out-of-touch billionaire. But now, she wondered why his words had struck a nerve. Perhaps it was the way he had looked at her, not with pity, but with genuine curiosity. It was rare for someone to see beyond her uniform, to question not just what she did, but why. By midday, Claire had just finished prepping a patient for surgery when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from her best friend, Mia. Lunch? Or are you saving the world today? Claire chuckled softly and texted back. World's still a mess, but I'll meet you at Joe's in 20. Joe's Diner was Claire's sanctuary, a no-frills spot where the coffee was strong and the conversation always felt like home. When she arrived, Mia was already seated, her curly hair piled on top of her head and a mischievous grin on her face. You're late? Mia teased as Claire slid into the booth. I'm always late, Claire shot back, picking up the menu even though she knew it by heart. Mia leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. So, tell me, how was the fancy gala last night? Did you rub elbows with the 1%? Claire rolled her eyes. More like endured elbows. It was exactly what you'd expect. A room full of rich people patting themselves on the back. And Mia pressed, her eyes sparkling. You meet anyone interesting? Claire hesitated, her mind flashing to Jonathan Steele. Not really, she said finally. Just a lot of big egos and bigger bank accounts. Liar, Mia declared, pointing her fork at her. You've got that look. What look? I met someone who's driving me crazy but I don't want to admit it look, Mia said with a smirk. Claire groaned. Okay, fine. There was this guy, Jonathan Steele. He's one of those self-made millionaire types. Arrogant, entitled, the whole package. Mia raised an eyebrow. And nothing, Claire said quickly. He's just, I don't know, annoying but interesting. Interesting how? Mia asked, her tone teasing but curious. Claire shrugged. He asked me why I do what I do. Like, really asked. Not in the patronizing way most people do, but like he actually wanted to understand. Mia leaned back, her expression thoughtful. Maybe he's not as shallow as he seems. Don't get your hopes up, Claire said with a laugh. He's still a billionaire with a god complex. Back at the hospital, Claire threw herself into her work, but the day had other plans. Just as she was wrapping up her shift, an emergency call came in. A car accident on the highway, multiple injuries, one critical. Claire was on call and immediately rushed to the trauma bay. The victim, a teenage boy, was wheeled in on a stretcher, unconscious and pale. The paramedics rattled off his vitals, and Claire's heart clenched. His injuries were severe, his chances slim. But there was no time for hesitation. Let's move, Claire barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. She directed the team with precision, her hands steady even as adrenaline coursed through her veins. Every second mattered, and Claire fought for every one of them. It was hours before the boy was stabilized and prepped for surgery. As the team wheeled him away, Claire leaned against the wall, her legs trembling from exhaustion. She knew the odds were still against him, but they had given him a chance, a small, fragile chance. Hannah approached, handing Claire a bottle of water. You're a miracle worker. You know that? Claire shook her head. Just doing my job. But as she sipped the water, a wave of emotion washed over her. It wasn't just the boy, it was everything. The weight of her work, the lives she touched, the lives she couldn't save. And, unbidden, the memory of Jonathan Steele's question returned. Why put yourself through that? Because, she thought, as tears stung her eyes, it's worth it. Later that evening, Claire sat by her small apartment window, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. The city stretched out below, its lights blinking like tiny beacons in the darkness. She thought about the boy in the trauma bay, about Mia's words at the diner, and about Jonathan Steele. Her life wasn't glamorous. She didn't have a penthouse or a fortune, but she had purpose. And for Claire, that was enough. The Steele family estate buzzed with activity as the crisp fall sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dining room. Jonathan Steele sat at the head of the table, his niece, Emily, to his right. She was 13, with a sharp wit that rivaled her uncle's and a smile that could soften even his hardest edges. Today, her laugh echoed through the room as she recounted a school prank. So, then we put the fake frog in Mr. Parnell's desk? Emily exclaimed between giggles. You should have seen his face. He jumped back like it was alive. Jonathan smirked, leaning back in his chair. Remind me to keep an eye on my desk when you visit my office. Emily grinned, but before she could reply, her expression shifted. She blinked rapidly, a hand coming up to her forehead. I feel dizzy, she murmured, her voice faint. Emily? Jonathan said, leaning forward. His smirk vanished, replaced by concern. Suddenly, Emily collapsed, her small frame crumpling against the chair. Panic erupted around the table as Jonathan sprang to his feet. Call 911, he shouted at the housekeeper, who rushed to grab the phone. His heart pounded as he knelt beside Emily, gently cradling her head. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. The ambulance arrived within minutes, its wail piercing the calm suburban air. Paramedics worked quickly, stabilizing Emily as Jonathan followed them to the vehicle, his jaw clenched and eyes wide with fear. He climbed into the back, holding her small hand as the ambulance sped toward St. Mary's Hospital. Every second felt like an eternity. Jonathan, who had always thrived in high-pressure situations, now found himself powerless. Stay with me, Em, he whispered, his voice breaking. You're going to be fine. But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. He had no control over this, not over her condition, not over the outcome. It terrified him. The emergency room was a whirlwind of activity as the paramedics wheeled Emily inside. Doctors and nurses converged, their voices sharp and purposeful as they assessed her condition. Jonathan stood frozen in the hallway, his fists clenched at his sides. Mr. Steele, a voice called, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to see a nurse approaching, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to the chaos around them. It took him a moment to recognize her. Claire Bennett. You, Jonathan said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Of all the hospitals, of all the nurses, it had to be her. Claire didn't flinch at his tone. Her focus was on Emily. Your niece is in good hands, she said firmly. We're doing everything we can. Jonathan's instincts kicked in, his need for control overriding his fear. I want the best care for her. Whatever it costs, she's already getting it, Claire interrupted, her tone cool but professional. Right now, we need to focus on stabilizing her. Jonathan stared at her, his chest tightening. Her calmness in the face of his panic was both infuriating and oddly reassuring. He nodded, stepping aside as she moved toward Emily's room. Hours passed, each minute stretching endlessly. Jonathan paced the waiting room, his expensive shoes clicking against the tiled floor. He couldn't stop replaying the moment Emily had collapsed. How had he missed the signs? Was there something he could have done? He thought about Claire, her composed demeanor under pressure. She had stepped in with the same quiet confidence he had found so maddening at the cafe. Now, he clung to it like a lifeline. Finally, Claire appeared in the doorway, her scrubs slightly rumpled but her expression steady. Jonathan rushed toward her. How is she? Is she okay? Claire held up a hand to calm him. Emily is stable for now. We're running tests to determine the cause of her collapse, but she's responding well to treatment." Jonathan exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Can I see her?" Claire hesitated before nodding. "She's resting, but you can sit with her. Just keep it quiet." Jonathan followed her down the hallway, his mind racing. He wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, and he didn't like it. Yet, as they reached Emily's room, he pushed those thoughts aside. All that mattered was her. Emily lay in the hospital bed, her small frame dwarfed by the crisp white sheets. Her eyelids fluttered open as Jonathan approached, and she offered him a weak smile. "Uncle John?" "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, sitting beside her. "You scared me there." "Sorry," Emily whispered, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to." Jonathan chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You'd better not. I'm not ready to lose my favorite troublemaker." Claire entered the room quietly, checking the monitors and making notes on her clipboard. Jonathan watched her work, her movements efficient and precise. He couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for her. She wasn't intimidated by him, wasn't swayed by his wealth or power. She just did her job, and she did it well. "Thank you," he said suddenly, his voice low. Claire looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For this." "For her," Jonathan said, nodding toward Emily. "I know I haven't exactly been pleasant, but you've been incredible." Claire studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Steele." "Jonathan," he corrected, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Call me Jonathan." Claire didn't respond, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Acceptance, perhaps, or understanding. As the night wore on, Jonathan remained by Emily's side, his usual bravado stripped away. He thought about his life, his choices, and the walls he had built around himself. For the first time, he saw the cracks in those walls, and he wondered if it was time to let them fall. The following morning, Emily's doctor arrived with a diagnosis, a previously undetected heart condition. It was serious but manageable with proper care. Jonathan felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. His niece would be okay. Claire stopped by to check on Emily before her shift ended. As she adjusted the foreline, Emily smiled at her. "Thank you for helping me," the young girl said softly. Claire's expression softened, and she reached out to squeeze Emily's hand. "You're a brave girl. You'll be just fine." Jonathan watched the interaction, a lump forming in his throat. Claire had saved Emily's life, and in doing so, she had given him something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. That day, as Jonathan left the hospital, he couldn't stop thinking about Claire. She had shown him a strength that had nothing to do with money or power, a strength he had long since forgotten. And though he didn't know it yet, their paths were about to cross in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The sun hung low over the city as Jonathan Steele parked his car outside St. Mary's Hospital for the third time in as many days. He wasn't sure why he kept coming back. Not anymore. Emily was recovering well, her heart condition manageable with treatment. He had made the necessary arrangements for her long-term care, sparing no expense. By all accounts, his involvement in the matter should have ended there. And yet, Jonathan found himself drawn back to this place. Not because of the hospital itself, but because of Claire Bennett. He didn't understand her, not fully. She had saved Emily's life, had done so without hesitation or fanfare. But there was something else, something about the way she carried herself, her quiet strength, that unsettled him. She wasn't like anyone he knew. She wasn't awed by his wealth, unimpressed by his status. And, more disturbingly, she seemed to see right through him. Jonathan wasn't used to being seen. Inside the hospital, Claire moved through the ward with her usual steady rhythm. Her shifts had been relentless since Emily's emergency, but she didn't mind. Work gave her purpose, and purpose gave her strength. Still, she couldn't ignore the weight of Jonathan's gaze whenever he visited. He wasn't like the other grateful family members she encountered. There was something about him, something unresolved, that made her uneasy. When she saw him leaning against the wall near Emily's room that afternoon, Claire braced herself. She approached with her clipboard in hand, her steps deliberate. "Mr. Steele," she said, her tone polite but professional. "Emily's doing well. There's no need for you to keep checking in." "Jonathan," he corrected. his voice quieter than she expected. "And I'm not here just for Emily." Claire raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to elaborate. Jonathan hesitated, uncharacteristically unsure of himself. Finally, he sighed. "I wanted to thank you. Properly this time." "You've already thanked me," Claire replied, her expression unreadable. "Not enough," Jonathan said, his voice softening. "You saved my niece's life. That's not something I take lightly." Claire studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. "It's my job, Jonathan. I didn't do it for gratitude." "I know," he said quickly. "That's what makes it even more remarkable." The sincerity in his tone caught Claire off guard. She shifted uncomfortably, not used to this kind of attention. "Is that all?" Jonathan shook his head. "No. I wanted to ask you something." "Ask me what?" He paused, running a hand through his hair. "Why? Why do you do it? Why work in a job where the hours are long, the pay is terrible, and the appreciation is rare?" Claire sighed, setting her clipboard down. "You've asked me that before, and you didn't really answer," Jonathan countered, his gaze steady. For a moment, Claire considered brushing him off. But something in his expression, a quiet desperation she hadn't noticed before, stopped her. She sat down on a nearby bench, motioning for him to join her. "I grew up watching people struggle," Claire began, her voice low. "My dad worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. My mom, she was sick most of my childhood. Cancer. She spent more time in hospitals than at home." Jonathan listened, his usual defenses nowhere to be found. "When I was 13, she got really bad," Claire continued, her eyes distant. "We couldn't afford the treatment she needed, but there was this nurse, Linda. She went above and beyond for my mom, made her feel human even when everything else was falling apart. I decided then that I wanted to be like her." Jonathan frowned, a pang of something unfamiliar tugging at him. "And your mom?" "She passed away," Claire said simply. "But Linda made those last months bearable, for her and for us. That's why I do this, because someone did it for me." Her words settled over them like a weight, heavy with meaning. Jonathan found himself at a loss for words, an experience as rare as it was uncomfortable. Finally, he managed. "That's admirable." Claire gave him a small, tired smile. "It's just life." Later that evening, Jonathan returned to his penthouse, but the usual sense of satisfaction he felt upon stepping into his luxurious domain was absent. Claire's story had stayed with him, haunting him in ways he couldn't quite understand. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city below. For years, Jonathan had prided himself on his ability to control everything. His business, his image, his relationships. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that, for all his success, he had built his life on a foundation that felt increasingly hollow. Claire's words played in his mind. "Someone did it for me." It wasn't just the story. It was the way she said it, with a quiet conviction that spoke of a life lived with purpose. He envied her, in a way. She didn't have his wealth, his power, but she had something he lacked: meaning. The next morning, Jonathan made an uncharacteristic decision. He canceled his meetings, telling Lydia he needed the day to himself. Then, he drove back to St. Mary's. Claire was in the middle of a chart review when she spotted him in the hallway. She sighed, setting down her pen. "You again?" Jonathan smirked, though it lacked its usual arrogance. "You make it sound like I'm stalking you." "You're here more than some of our staff," Claire said dryly. Jonathan chuckled, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. "Can we talk?" Claire hesitated, glancing at the clock. Her shift was nearly over. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "Fine. 10 minutes." They sat outside on a small bench overlooking the hospital's garden. Jonathan looked out at the flowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the hospital. "I owe you more than a thank you," he began, his voice unusually soft. "I owe you an apology." Claire blinked, caught off guard. "For what?" "For everything," Jonathan said, gesturing vaguely. "For being the kind of person who looks down on people like you. For not understanding what you do, or why it matters. Meeting you has made me realize how blind I've been." Claire studied him, her skepticism warring with something softer. "What brought this on?" Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "You did. Emily did. Watching you fight for her, hearing your story, it's made me think about my own life. And I don't like what I see." For the first time, Claire saw a glimpse of vulnerability in Jonathan Steele. She didn't know if it was genuine or if it would last, but in that moment, it felt real. "I don't need your apology," Claire said finally. "What I need is for people like you to understand that we're all human. No amount of money changes that." Jonathan nodded, her words sinking in. "I'm starting to." As they parted ways, Jonathan felt something shift inside him. Claire Bennett wasn't just a nurse. She was a reminder of everything he had forgotten. And for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of change. Jonathan Steele woke up to the unfamiliar weight of self-reflection. For years, his mornings had followed the same pattern. Coffee brewed precisely at 7 a.m., a meticulously curated briefing waiting on his desk, and a calendar packed with power moves designed to cement his dominance in the business world. But today, none of that mattered. Instead, he sat at his kitchen island, a half-empty mug of coffee cooling in his hands, staring blankly at the New York skyline. The conversation with Claire the day before lingered in his mind, each word a quiet rebuke to the life he had built. For the first time in his adult life, Jonathan found himself questioning everything. Claire's voice echoed in his memory. "We're all human. No amount of money changes that." Later that morning, Jonathan found himself back at St. Mary's. It had become an unspoken ritual, a place where the carefully constructed walls of his identity seemed to falter. He didn't go to Emily's room this time. She was recovering well and didn't need him hovering. Instead, he wandered through the corridors, observing the quiet heroism of the hospital staff. He noticed Claire near the nurse's station, her focus sharp as she conferred with a colleague over a chart. She looked up and caught his gaze, her brow furrowing slightly. "Jonathan," she said as he approached, her tone cautious. "What brings you here today?" "I wanted to talk," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Claire crossed her arms, studying him. "You're becoming a regular here. People might start thinking you work for us." Jonathan chuckled, though the sound lacked its usual bravado. "Maybe I should. God knows I need a change." Claire raised an eyebrow. "A change?" "Yeah," Jonathan admitted, surprising even himself. "You said something yesterday about understanding that we're all human. It's been sticking with me." Claire's posture softened slightly, though her skepticism remained. "And what are you planning to do with that realization?" Jonathan hesitated, his mind racing. He hadn't expected to be pressed for answers so soon. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I want to start by understanding more about people like you, the work you do. I want to help." Claire blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You want to help?" "Yes," Jonathan said, his voice firm despite his uncertainty. "I've spent my whole life building something that only benefits people like me. Maybe it's time to build something that benefits others." Claire didn't know what to make of Jonathan's sudden transformation. He was sincere. She could see that, but sincerity didn't guarantee follow-through. Still, there was something about his vulnerability, his willingness to admit he didn't have all the answers, that struck a chord in her. "If you're serious about helping," she said slowly, "then start small. Spend time here. Get to know the people you say you want to help. It's not about grand gestures. It's about understanding." Jonathan nodded, his resolve hardening. "Okay, where do I start?" Claire handed him a clipboard. "You can shadow me for the day. Just don't get in the way." The hours that followed were a whirlwind. Jonathan had always considered himself a master multitasker, but shadowing Claire left him exhausted. He watched as she moved from room to room, administering medication, checking vitals, and offering words of comfort to patients and their families. It was relentless work, but Claire never wavered. In one room, an elderly man gripped Claire's hand, his voice trembling as he thanked her for her kindness. In another, a young mother wept quietly as Claire reassured her about her child's prognosis. Jonathan stood back, watching, absorbing. Each interaction peeled away another layer of his ignorance, exposing a world he had never truly seen. By the end of the day, Jonathan was spent. He leaned against the wall near the staff lounge, rubbing his temples. Claire joined him, a bottle of water in hand. "Long day?" she asked, her tone teasing. Jonathan let out a tired laugh. "How do you do this every day?" Claire shrugged. "You get used to it, or you don't. Either way, the work has to get done." Jonathan looked at her, his expression earnest. "I don't think I could." Claire smiled faintly. "You're not supposed to. This isn't your world." Jonathan nodded slowly, her words hitting home. "But maybe it should be." Over the next few weeks, Jonathan began to change. He kept coming back to the hospital, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone willing to learn. He volunteered in small ways, delivering meals, sitting with patients who needed company, even organizing supply closets. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Claire watched him from a distance, her skepticism gradually giving way to a reluctant admiration. He wasn't just talking about change, he was living it. And though she wouldn't say it out loud, she found herself rooting for him. One evening, as Claire was finishing her shift, she found Jonathan waiting for her near the entrance. He held 2 steaming cups of coffee, offering one to her with a tentative smile. "Peace offering," he said. Claire took the cup, raising an eyebrow. "What did you do now?" "Nothing," Jonathan said quickly. "I just thought you could use it." They sat on a bench outside the hospital, the city lights casting a soft glow around them. For a while, they drank in silence, the weight of the day settling over them. "Thank you," Jonathan said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Claire looked at him, puzzled. "For what?" "For not giving up on me," he said. "You could have written me off as just another arrogant billionaire, and you wouldn't have been wrong. But you didn't." Claire's expression softened, though her voice remained steady. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because people like Emily deserve someone who cares." Jonathan nodded, his gaze dropping to his cup. "I know, and I want to be that person too. For her. For others." Claire didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're getting there," she said quietly. "But it's a long road." Jonathan met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "I'm ready for it," he said simply. As they parted ways that night, Claire couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Jonathan Steele was capable of real change. And for the first time, Jonathan felt the same. The days at St. Mary's blended into weeks, and with each passing visit, Jonathan Steele became less of a curiosity and more of a fixture within the hospital walls. At first, the nurses and doctors had watched him with skepticism, their side glances and whispers following him as he walked through the corridors. A millionaire in their midst was a novelty, after all, but gradually, his persistence wore down their doubts. He was learning, slowly, clumsily, but sincerely. One afternoon, Jonathan sat in the hospital's modest cafeteria, eating a sandwich that was more bread than filling. Across the table sat Claire, who was picking at a cup of yogurt. The two of them had fallen into an unspoken routine, meals shared in quiet reflection after long hours on the ward. "You're getting better at this," Claire remarked, breaking the silence. Her tone was neutral, but the faint curve of her lips betrayed her amusement. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Better at what?" "Eating hospital food?" Claire chuckled softly. "Better at being human." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That's a low bar, isn't it?" "Maybe," Claire admitted. "But you're clearing it." The compliment, such as it was, made Jonathan smile. He wasn't used to earning approval for anything other than success and power. This was different, harder, but more meaningful. Later that day, Jonathan found himself in the pediatric wing, helping to entertain a group of young patients. Claire had roped him into it, handing him a puppet and pushing him toward the circle of children without so much as a warning. "I'm not good with kids," Jonathan had protested, holding the puppet as though it might bite him. "They don't care," Claire had replied with a shrug. "Just make them laugh." Now, sitting cross-legged on the floor, Jonathan was surprised to find himself laughing along with the children. They didn't care who he was or how much money he had. They cared about the silly voices he made, the way he flubbed his lines, the exaggerated expressions on his face. It was humbling and liberating all at once. Claire watched from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. There was something different about Jonathan now, something softer, less guarded. He was still rough around the edges, still prone to moments of arrogance, but he was trying. And for Claire, that mattered more than anything. The next evening, Jonathan returned to the hospital with an envelope in hand. He waited near the nurse's station, his nerves uncharacteristically frayed. When Claire finally appeared, he stood up, clearing his throat. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked. Claire glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah, it's just this." He held out the envelope, his fingers tightening around the edges. "It's for the nursing fund. I know it's not enough, but—" Claire took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a check with a staggering amount written on it. Her eyes widened, and she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Jonathan, this is a lot of money." "It's not enough," he said quickly. "It'll never be enough. But I've been thinking about what you said, about the people who can't afford care, the single mothers, the elderly. I want to help. For real this time." Claire's grip on the envelope tightened. "I appreciate this, Jonathan. I do. But throwing money at a problem isn't the same as solving it." "I know," he said, his voice quieter now. "That's why I'm not stopping here. I want to do more, whatever it takes." Claire studied him for a long moment, her skepticism warring with the flicker of hope she felt. Finally, she nodded. "All right, let's see if you mean it." The following weeks marked a turning point in Jonathan's journey. He began meeting with hospital administrators, asking tough questions about funding and resources. He pushed for transparency, using his influence to rally support from other wealthy donors. He even started attending nursing staff meetings, sitting quietly in the back as Claire and her colleagues discussed the challenges they faced. It wasn't easy. Jonathan was used to being in control, to calling the shots. Here, he had to listen, to learn. He made mistakes, plenty of them, but each time, Claire was there to guide him, her patience tempered by her unyielding honesty. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, the two of them found themselves on the hospital rooftop. The city stretched out before them, its lights twinkling like stars. Jonathan leaned against the railing, his suit jacket draped over one arm. "Do you ever wonder if it's enough?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. Claire turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "What do you mean?" "All of this," Jonathan said, gesturing vaguely. "The work you do, the changes I'm trying to make. Does it ever feel like we're just putting band-aids on a bullet wound?" Claire considered his words, her gaze steady. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But even a band-aid can stop someone from bleeding out. And sometimes that's enough." Jonathan nodded, her words sinking in. For the first time, he understood what she meant, not just intellectually, but emotionally. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about doing what you could, where you could, for as long as you could. The shift in Jonathan didn't go unnoticed. Emily, now fully recovered, had begun teasing him about his newfound altruism. "Uncle John, who knew you had a heart?" she joked one afternoon as they sat in her hospital room. Jonathan smirked, ruffling her hair. Don't get used to it. But even as he deflected her teasing, he knew she was right. He was changing, not for her, not even for Claire, but for himself. And for the first time in years, he felt whole. One day, as Jonathan was leaving the hospital, Claire called out to him. He turned to see her jogging toward him, her expression softer than usual. "Hey," she said, slightly out of breath. "I just wanted to say, you're doing good work." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Good work? From you? That almost sounds like a compliment." Claire rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. "Don't let it go to your head." Jonathan chuckled, holding her gaze a moment longer than necessary. "Thanks, Claire. That means a lot." As she walked away, Jonathan felt something stir inside him, a quiet but persistent hope. He wasn't just redeeming himself in her eyes. He was learning to see himself in a new light. The hospital corridors were quiet that evening, the hum of fluorescent lights echoing against the walls as Jonathan Steele walked toward the garden. It had been weeks since he first started spending his days here, learning from Claire and immersing himself in the hospital's world. Yet, despite everything, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something missing, some unspoken truth lingering between them. He found Claire sitting on a bench beneath the glow of soft garden lights. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. She was wrapped in her navy blue jacket, her hands cradling a steaming cup of tea. Her posture was relaxed, but her expression was distant, as though she were miles away. "Mind if I join you?" Jonathan asked, his voice soft. Claire glanced up, startled, but then nodded. "Sure." He sat beside her, the wooden bench creaking under his weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jonathan let his gaze drift over the garden, the well-tended flower beds, the ivy creeping along the low stone walls. It was peaceful, but the silence between them felt heavy, charged with unspoken words. "You've been quiet today," he said finally, his tone tentative. Claire shrugged, her eyes fixed on the tea in her hands. "It's been a long week." Jonathan nodded, unsure how to proceed. He had spent weeks getting to know Claire, her dedication, her strength, her quiet compassion. But there was a part of her he still couldn't reach, a wall she kept firmly in place. He knew better than to push, but tonight, he felt compelled to try. "You know," he began, choosing his words carefully, "you've seen me at my worst. But I feel like I still don't really know you." Claire glanced at him, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Jonathan said simply. "But maybe we can start with the walls you keep putting up." Claire's smile faded, her gaze dropping to her tea. For a long moment, she didn't respond, the silence stretching between them. Jonathan waited, his patience uncharacteristic but genuine. He had learned that rushing Claire was futile. She would speak when she was ready. Finally, she sighed, her voice low. "It's not that simple, Jonathan. I'm not asking for simple," he said softly. "I'm asking for honesty." Claire shook her head, her grip tightening on the cup. "You don't want to know." "I do," Jonathan said, leaning forward. "I want to understand." Her shoulders tensed, and for a moment, Jonathan thought she might shut him out again. But then she exhaled, the sound heavy with resignation. "Fine. You want honesty? Here it is." What followed was a story that left Jonathan reeling. Claire spoke haltingly at first, her words weighed down by years of pain. She told him about her father, a kind but struggling man who had poured his heart and soul into a small business. How he had worked tirelessly to provide for their family, even as financial pressures mounted, and how, in the end, it hadn't been enough. His company was everything to him, Claire said, her voice trembling. He built it from the ground up, poured everything he had into it. But one day it was gone. Just gone. Jonathan frowned, a knot tightening in his stomach. What happened? Claire hesitated, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. A corporate takeover. Some big conglomerate swept in, bought out his contracts, and left him with nothing. He tried to fight it, but he didn't stand a chance. He lost everything. His business, his pride. Himself. Jonathan's breath caught, the weight of her words settling over him like a lead blanket. He didn't need to ask which corporation had been responsible. The truth was already staring him in the face. "It was me," he said, his voice barely audible. "My company. We did this." Claire's gaze hardened, her hands tightening around the cup. "I figured that out a long time ago." The air between them grew heavy, the silence crackling with tension. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face, his chest tightening with guilt. "Claire, don't," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "Don't apologize. It won't change anything." Jonathan's hands clenched into fists, his mind racing. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to outmaneuver competitors, to dominate markets without a second thought. He had told himself it was just business, that the casualties along the way were a necessary cost of success. But now, faced with the human cost of his ambition, he felt a crushing sense of shame. "Tell me what I can do," he said, his voice trembling. "Tell me how to fix this." Claire finally looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You can't fix it, Jonathan. My dad is gone. That pain, it's a part of me now. But what you can do is stop pretending that throwing money at the problem will make it go away. If you want to help, Really help, you have to change. Jonathan nodded, her words cutting through him like a blade. I am changing, he said, his voice fierce. Because of you. Because you've shown me what it means to care about something more than myself. Claire's expression softened, though the sadness in her eyes remained. I want to believe you, Jonathan. I really do. But it's not that easy. It never is, Jonathan said quietly. But I'll keep trying. For you, for Emily, for everyone I've hurt. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the tension between them slowly giving way to something softer, more vulnerable. Claire didn't say anything, but the faintest nod of her head was enough to give Jonathan hope. In the days that followed, Jonathan threw himself into his mission with renewed determination. He partnered with the hospital to create programs that provided free healthcare to underprivileged communities. He reached out to struggling business owners, offering not just financial support but mentorship, determined to rebuild what he had once destroyed. Claire watched him from a distance, her emotions a turbulent mix of admiration and caution. She wanted to believe in him, to trust that his transformation was real. But years of pain couldn't be erased overnight. One evening, as they walked through the hospital together, Jonathan turned to her. Do you think I'm doing enough? Claire stopped, her eyes searching his. You're doing more than I ever expected. But you're not there yet. Jonathan nodded, accepting her words. I'll keep going. That night, as Claire sat alone in her apartment, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe Jonathan Steele wasn't just another arrogant billionaire. Maybe, just maybe, he was capable of change. Jonathan Steele stood at the entrance of St. Mary's Hospital, clutching a folder filled with proposals and financial plans. He had spent the past week working tirelessly with consultants and administrators, pulling every string he could to turn his ideas into reality. The man who once thrived on ruthless efficiency now found himself humbled by the complexity of rebuilding trust and creating real impact. As he stepped inside, Jonathan's gaze shifted to the bustling activity around him. Nurses hurried past, their scrubs rustling softly, while patients moved through the halls, some with cautious hope, others with weary resignation. It wasn't just a hospital to Jonathan anymore. It was a lifeline for so many, including himself. The first meeting of the day was with Dr. Morales, the hospital's chief administrator. Jonathan presented his plans for a new community healthcare initiative, a comprehensive program offering free medical care, education, and resources to underserved neighborhoods. The program, he explained, would be funded not just by him, but by a coalition of donors he had personally rallied. Dr. Morales leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the folder in front of him. This is ambitious, he said finally. Jonathan nodded. It has to be. These communities need more than Band-Aids. They need real, lasting solutions. And you think you can provide that? Dr. Morales asked, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. I'm not doing this alone, Jonathan replied. I've brought in experts, people who know what these communities need because they've lived it. This isn't about me. It's about them. Dr. Morales studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. All right, let's make it happen. Meanwhile, Claire watched Jonathan's efforts from afar, her emotions a mixture of admiration and guarded hope. She had seen countless promises made by powerful people, many of which amounted to little more than empty gestures. But Jonathan was different. He wasn't just writing checks. He was showing up, listening, learning. It was a slow, messy process, but it was real. One afternoon, Claire found herself in the pediatric wing, where Jonathan had been spending a surprising amount of time. He was sitting on the floor with a group of children, helping them build a tower of wooden blocks. His suit jacket was draped over a nearby chair, his tie loosened, and his sleeves rolled up. Careful, Emily, he said to one of the girls, his tone gentle but encouraging. That piece needs to go on top, or the whole thing might fall. The girl giggled, her small hands carefully placing the block. When the tower stood firm, the group erupted in cheers, Jonathan included. Claire leaned against the doorway, a small smile tugging at her lips. He looked so different now, relaxed, unguarded, almost unrecognizable from the man she had first met. For the first time, She allowed herself to believe that his transformation might be genuine. "You're not half bad with kids," she remarked, stepping into the room. Jonathan looked up, his expression softening when he saw her. "They don't care who you are," he said with a shrug. "It's refreshing." Claire chuckled, sitting down beside him. "You're right. They don't." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the children began building another tower. Then Jonathan turned to her, his voice quiet. "Do you think I'm doing enough?" Claire met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "You're doing a lot. But enough? That's not for me to decide." Jonathan nodded, her words settling over him like a weight. I want to make things right." "You're on the right path," Claire said, "but it's a long one." As the weeks passed, Jonathan's efforts began to bear fruit. The Community Healthcare Initiative launched with a modest pilot program, providing free screenings and educational workshops in 2 of the city's most underserved neighborhoods. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people turned out, many of whom hadn't seen a doctor in years. Jonathan attended the first event, standing quietly at the back as nurses and volunteers worked tirelessly to serve the crowd. Claire spotted him near the makeshift reception area, his expression a mixture of pride and humility. "You did good," she said, approaching him. "We did good," Jonathan corrected, a small smile playing at his lips. Claire tilted her head, studying him. "You're starting to sound like one of us." Jonathan chuckled. "Maybe I am." One evening, as Claire was wrapping up her shift, she found Jonathan waiting for her near the hospital entrance. He held 2 cups of coffee, offering one to her with a tentative smile. "Peace offering," he said. Claire raised an eyebrow. "What are you apologizing for this time?" "Nothing," Jonathan replied quickly. "I just thought you could use it." They walked together to the nearby park, the crisp night air carrying the scent of fallen leaves. They found a bench near a quiet fountain, the soft sound of water filling the spaces between their words. "You've changed," Claire said after a long pause, her voice gentle. "So have you," Jonathan replied. Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" "When I first met you, you kept everyone at arm's length," Jonathan said. "I get it now, why you did it. But you've let me in. That means more to me than you know." Claire looked down at her coffee, her thoughts swirling. He wasn't wrong. Letting him in had been a risk, one she hadn't been sure she wanted to take. But now, sitting beside him, she realized how much she had come to value his presence. "You've earned it," she said quietly. Jonathan's breath caught, her words hitting him harder than he expected. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just making amends. He was becoming someone worthy of her trust. As the night deepened, they sat together in the park, the city lights casting a soft glow around them. For the first time in years, Jonathan Steele felt at peace. And for the first time, Claire Bennett felt hope. The grand opening of the new Steele Bennett Community Healthcare Center was a modest affair by Jonathan Steele's usual standards. There were no red carpets or swarms of media, no extravagant displays of wealth or power. Instead, the event was quiet, personal, exactly as Claire had envisioned it. Families from nearby neighborhoods trickled into the center, their faces filled with cautious hope as they toured the newly renovated space. Jonathan stood near the entrance, watching as volunteers handed out brochures and guided visitors through the brightly lit rooms. The center was everything he had hoped it would be, a safe haven for people who had been overlooked for far too long. Claire approached him, clipboard in hand, her expression a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "Looks like a good turnout," she said. Jonathan nodded, his gaze never leaving the crowd. "It's a start." Claire studied him for a moment, a small smile tugging at her lips. He was different now, not just in the way he carried himself, but in the way he saw the world. She had watched him grow from an arrogant businessman into someone who genuinely cared, someone who was willing to fight for change. "You should be proud of this," she said softly. Jonathan turned to her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. "I couldn't have done it without you." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a woman approached them. She was older, with silver-streaked hair and a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She held a small bouquet of flowers, which she offered to Claire. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling. "This place, It's going to save lives. Claire accepted the flowers, her cheeks flushing. Thank you for coming. We're glad you're here. The woman nodded, her eyes lingering on Jonathan. And thank you, Mr. Steele. My husband used to work for one of your companies. He always said you were a hard man, but fair. I think he'd be proud of what you're doing now. Jonathan's chest tightened, the weight of her words settling over him. He nodded, his voice thick. Thank you. That means a lot. As the evening wore on, the crowd began to thin. Claire and Jonathan found themselves alone in one of the consultation rooms, tidying up brochures and leftover decorations. The quiet was comforting, a moment of respite after the whirlwind of the day. You've come a long way, Claire said, her tone light but sincere. So have you, Jonathan replied, glancing at her. Claire frowned. What do you mean? When we first met, you didn't trust me, Jonathan said. And I don't blame you. But now it feels like we're on the same side. Claire hesitated, her thoughts swirling. She wanted to tell him he was right, that she had grown to trust him, even to care for him. But the words felt too big, too soon. Instead, she said, we've come a long way. Later that night, as they locked up the center, Claire turned to Jonathan. Do you have a minute? There's something I want to show you. Jonathan nodded, intrigued. Lead the way. They walked a few blocks to a quiet residential street, the air crisp with the scent of autumn leaves. Claire stopped in front of a modest house with a small, well-kept garden. She hesitated for a moment before stepping through the gate. This was my parents' house, she said, her voice soft. I haven't been here in years. Jonathan followed her, his gaze taking in the worn but sturdy structure. There was a quiet dignity to the place, a sense of history that reminded him of Claire herself. Claire led him to the backyard, where a weathered wooden bench sat beneath an old oak tree. She gestured for him to sit, then took a seat beside him. My dad used to sit here every evening, she said, her eyes distant. He'd watch the sunset, no matter how bad the day had been. He always said it reminded him that tomorrow was a new chance to start over. Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He sounds like a good man. He was, Claire said, her voice trembling. He taught me everything I know about resilience, about finding hope in the hardest places. And when he lost his business, when everything fell apart, he never blamed anyone. Not even the people who took it from him. Jonathan looked down at his hands, guilt washing over him. Claire, you don't have to say it, Claire interrupted, her tone gentle. I know. And I've spent a long time being angry, not just at you, but at the world. But I've realized something. Holding on to that anger doesn't change anything. What changes things is what we do with it. Jonathan nodded, her words settling over him like a balm. You've changed me, Claire. More than you'll ever know. Claire smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. And you've shown me that people can change. That's worth something. As they walked back to the center, the city lights casting a soft glow around them, Jonathan felt a quiet peace settle over him. He wasn't just making amends. He was building a new life, one filled with purpose and meaning. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Claire glanced at him, her expression soft. You know, my dad used to say that every sunset is a promise. A promise that no matter how dark things get, there's always light on the other side. Jonathan looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I think he was right. They stood together in the quiet street, the world around them falling away. And in that moment, for the first time, Jonathan Steele felt whole.